A crystal chandelier throws a fractured light into a puddle on cobblestone, the glitter of a banquet hall and the gray of a gutter caught in the same frame. Inside, waiters move like orchestra members, trays of folded napkins and smoked salmon passing beneath chandeliers. Outside, under a rusted bus stop awning 2 blocks away, a woman pulls a thin blanket tighter around a small shape in her lap. Rain makes the street into glass. Headlights smear through drops. The world splits along the seam of those 2 images. He sees her twice in one night. The first glimpse is incidental, a figure at the edge of the valet circle as Samuel steps from the car, the edge of a blanket flapping in the rain like a small, stubborn flag. He is halfway down his driveway before the sight latches to him. The way the baby's head rests against the woman's collarbone, the way she rocks him slowly, not to keep him asleep, but because the motion is the only warmth she can give. A luxury can wait, he thinks, and get swallowed by the current of appointments and applause that will be tonight. By the time the microphones are on and the hall has leaned forward to drink every earnest word, the image from the curb sits like a splinter under his skin. He talks about purpose the way he has learned to, clearly, measured, without the tremor that used to suggest doubt. Guests applaud charity in general terms, donations, endowments, the elegant abstraction of help. It is tidy, it is safe. But Samuel's mind keeps returning to a soaked blanket and a tiny wet fist. The speech that evening is not a set of solutions. It is a confession that he does not have all the answers. He says, in the kind of voice meant to move wallets rather than lives, that true generosity is closer to presence than to press releases. He notices the effect, faces softened, cameras angling closer, but also notices his own hands shaking when he takes a glass. Public conviction will not, he knows, replace an image that has taken root. After the applause dies and the room begins to tilt back into its separate conversations, investment strategy murmurs, gentle laughter at a private joke, Samuel slips out to the small terrace that runs like a balcony over the street. Rain clatters against the awning and turns the city lights into a watercolor. He watches umbrellas become smudges in the downpour. For no good reason, he asks the valet if he remembers the woman by the curb. Yeah, the valet says. She stayed even after the bus passed. Poor thing. Samuel finds his phone heavy in his pocket. He thinks of charity as architecture, foundations, programs, long-term plans. But there is an architecture of moments too, he thinks, and not every brick can be laid from a stage. He could leave it to his foundation. He could do nothing. He could cross the street. He does not tell the audience. He crosses the street. The rain is a sheet that grazes the collar of his coat. Inside his umbrella, the world is a dry, private hemisphere. The bus stop is luckless and bright, with a flickering fluorescent. The woman's hair is damp against her scalp, her coat threadbare in a way that exacts cold. She looks up when he approaches, not startled, but careful, as someone who has learned to measure the tone of a stranger's voice before accepting anything else. "Are you all right?" he hears himself ask. The formality of the question feels ridiculous in the rain, but the words are the opener a decent human being keeps handy. She looks at him slowly. Close up, he sees the baby's hair matted with rain, the small fist that clutches the cloth of her shirt. Her eyes are sharp. They have watched people give pity before. They have learned how to accept without being owned. "I'm fine," she says. Her voice is small but steady. "We're waiting." "Do you need a place to dry off?" he asks, and the offering stumbles over itself. Too many assumptions bundled into a single sentence. He means shelter, but he also knows that shelter is the beginning of a conversation that can make someone feel indebted, exposed, or grateful in a way that hides the rest of them. She studies him as if reading a line of terms. "Who would I be staying with?" she asks finally, not mean, but necessary. "What would be expected of me?" He does not have a ready script for this. He has PR people, a communications director, legal counsel who would prefer protocols over spontaneity. He has not rehearsed offering a stranger his home for the night. Just to get dry, he says, a hot drink, a blanket, no obligations. She watches him. A car splashes by, and the rain draws gray rivers down her cheek, false like a trouble she does not want to advertise. Finally, she nods once, the kind of agreement that keeps the options open. A driver is sent, a discreet black SUV with a chauffeur who has worked for this family for years and knows how to be a presence without a spotlight. They both climb into the back seat, the woman, careful with the baby, and a man whose cufflinks wink like small moons. On the short drive to Samuel's townhouse, they do not speak much. The woman keeps the baby in the crook of her arm, whispering to him occasionally in a language Samuel does not immediately place. A soft rhythm that looks like prayer and sounds like lullaby. Samuel watches his reflection move in the window as they go by, a distorted version of himself against a city that will not slow down for anybody's indecision. They get out at the side entrance. A housekeeper appears with towels and a blanket, relief written in the quick choreography of domestic staff who understand the temporary intrusion of life into order. Samuel tries to act normal. He signs a check, instructs the driver, avoids dramatics. "Will you be able to get somewhere to sleep after this?" he asks the woman before he leaves. And the question is both practical and political. It asks whether generosity will end at the threshold. She meets his eyes and gives a gesture that is all balance. "I can manage. I can find a shelter," she says. "Tonight, if you are offering, thank you." It is not a grand answer. It is not a vow. It is gratitude with a hinge. "Stay warm," he says, saying more than he intends. He presses a card into the palm of his hand, a card that says a name and a number, a small assurance that if she needs anything, she might call. Both of them know that numbers are fragile promises. Both of them hope for more than promises. He leaves them to the driver and to the staff. He has another engagement, a dinner to host for investors, a conversation to close, a speech to refine. He moves through his schedule the way a conductor moves through a score, precise, practiced, and leaving room for improvisation when the moment demands. The rain does not stop. Back at home, in a room that smells faintly of lemon oil and old money, the woman lays the baby down on a couch lined with towels. He watches her, how she checks his breathing, how she counts his tiny chest for the rhythm of it. She hums a low counter melody to the city's percussion. She does this with the measured confidence of somebody who has had to learn small economies of care. She tells Samuel's driver that she does not want to impose, that she will leave in the morning. The driver, used to a particular kind of person, simply nods and leaves them with a soft word about tea and a corner where they can sleep. The house seems to breathe in the presence of someone not born to its rooms. There is a new quiet in the spaces where Crystal once sang. Samuel takes the rest of his evening obligations lightly. He answers questions from a reporter, takes photographs, smiles for the camera. In the back of his head, the image of the baby under a blanket hums like a tuning fork, setting the pitch for everything else. He means to check in. He wants to ensure that he has not left them in some awkward position. He plans a quick call. He does not get the call out. Halfway through a conversation about a new community health initiative, his phone rings with the suppressed urgency of a private line. It is his driver, voice clipped and tight. "Sir," the driver says, "your father. He collapsed at home. We've called an ambulance. Miss," he hesitates for a name he does not know. "She's here. She was the one who called for help. She's been helping him." Samuel feels the room tilt. The narrative of the evening rearranges itself with the simple shift of that sentence. The person he meant to shelter becomes the person who alerts him to disaster. He rushes through the party like a man who has to force the city to slow down. He is on the other side of the car again, white-knuckled, heartbeat counting steps. At home, the front door opens to a scene of controlled chaos. Paramedics press their hands over a body, and move with a choreography that looks like a practiced prayer. Edivaldo is on a stretcher. His face is set in a way that makes his age visible, lines like old map ridges. The paramedics talk in clipped sentences about stabilizing vitals, getting him to the emergency room, a possible cardiac event, but not enough information for certainty. They do what they always do. They act. Samuel is given space and then not given space. There are things to sign, names to give, authorizations. He feels outside himself. Then someone, one of the paramedics, a woman with a calm that is all expertise, pulls him aside. She recognized the signs, she says, nodding toward Natalia, who sits with the baby in the corner, a blanket over her knees. She kept him breathing upright until we arrived. She stayed and helped with his breathing and kept him from aspirating. She called the emergency number and told us the location, symptoms, helped calm him. She did a lot. Samuel hears it like a bell. The world narrows to a precise shape. He had been thinking about structures, about how philanthropy is measured in programs and pounds and press. He had thought giving was about opening doors. Now he watches a woman with wet hair and a thin blanket fold herself into something steadier than the house. She is not thanking him. She is taking care of a man she barely knows because the thing needed to be done. There is an integrity to that embarrasses him. He wants to say thank you, to make it right, to offer what money can do, now that its limits have been revealed. But the paramedic keeps the conversation to the facts. We can't tell you prognosis in the field, she says, but he was in a precarious state, and her quick thinking helped a lot. Healthcare moves on schedule. Paperwork and procedures cut the night into sections. The ambulance door closes. The siren wails twice, a sad double note that leaves some rooms raw and some rooms stabilized. Samuel climbs into the ambulance with them because he will not be left in the house with the echo of an unresolved thing. He wants to be close. He wants to see the action that his wealth purchased but did not cause. On his collar, a raindrop leaves a bright path. In the back of the ambulance, Natalia sits on the stretcher's edge with the baby in her arms, pale cheeks flushed from the abrupt movement. She keeps the baby covered, her fingers finding the baby's hand occasionally, as if to reassure both of them. She is composed, which again surprises Samuel. Not because he expected her to be anything less than capable, but because his image of the night had been full of need, and now it is full of agency. The lights blur past. The city is a smear of neon and wet reflections. Samuel sits with his hands clenched around what feels like the uselessness of his cufflinks. He watches Natalia as she watches nothing at all. Some part of her mind already moving past crisis, making a list of things to do when the ambulance doors open. He notices small details. A crescent-shaped scar on her forearm, a faint tilt to the way she supports the baby's head. Little sutures of life that seem private and also, in this sudden intimacy, visible. At the hospital, they move as a team. Edivaldo is triaged and rushed to a room where a fluorescent light throws everything into equal clarity. Tests are ordered with a brisk efficiency that makes the emergency room into a machine built for problem solving. Samuel hovers, impatient, grateful, wanting to understand the thin line between what might have been and what now could be. He watches the medical staff move like a chorus, and he thinks, not for the first time, about the difference between money's ability to open doors and its inability to replace the quiet skills any one person can bring in a crisis. The doctors ask questions: timeline, symptoms, any history of heart disease. The driver, flustered and honest, explains that Edivaldo had been complaining of chest tightness earlier but brushed it off. Natalia steps forward, and when she speaks, it is to give precise observations. When he lost color, how his speech slurred, how he had difficulty lifting his arm. She recites exactly what she did to keep him from choking when he lost consciousness. She kept him on his side, she made sure his mouth was clear, she called the emergency number, and stayed with him until professionals arrived. The doctor's eyes narrow, not with skepticism, but with the professional relief of someone who hears the words that add to a chain of evidence. She did well, the doctor says softly, not minimizing the severity of what happened, but acknowledging the role a calm witness can play in those first minutes. Samuel stands to the side and feels a complicated gratitude. He had meant to help in small ways, a blanket, a hot drink, perhaps a small donation from the foundation. And someone else, with fewer material means but a different kind of resource, knowledge, presence, decisive hands, had kept his father alive. The irony is not lost on him. The world is not a place where currency always buys what matters. It sometimes buys proximity, but not competence and not love. He crosses the room without consciously deciding to. Natalia senses it before he reaches her, perhaps because people in such situations are attuned to the rhythms of gratitude and the gestures of power. He stops a few steps away, and he feels the shame of being both grateful and ashamed. Grateful because of what she did, ashamed because her action now places him in a position where he cannot simply return the favor with a check. "Thank you," he says. It is an inadequate phrase, a word like a bandage over something that needs a different fix. He wants to offer more. He wants to know if she is hungry, if she is cold, if there is a way to repay her. She looks at him and gives nothing performative. "People help each other sometimes," she says. "Tonight, it happened to be me." There is a dignity in her refusal to be a spectacle. She does not want a public thanks. She does not want to be turned into a campaign photo. She is not a symbol. She is an individual who has made a series of choices. Choices born of experience and necessity and a stubborn sense of responsibility. Samuel feels his public pronouncements on stage shrink around the sudden truth that the world is held together by countless small acts that rarely find headlines. The hours wind and align themselves in the hospital's peculiar calendar. The time between tests, the waiting for blood work, the periodic updates that mean everything without saying much. Edivaldo is admitted for observation. The doctors outline a careful, medically sound plan, a cardiac catheterization on the morrow, monitoring, medication to stabilize rhythm. No miracles are promised. There is instead competence and a plan. Samuel breathes in that plan and lets it steady him. Natalia declines the offer of a chair and instead sits on a bench outside the room with the baby, swaddled against her chest. She watches Edivaldo through the glass and then watches Samuel watching the machines and the people moved by them. It is a strange intimacy, mutual observation without the need to narrate. The corridor smells faintly of antiseptic and coffee. Time is measured in the hiss of the vending machine and the footsteps of nurses. At some point, Samuel reaches out and slides a small paper cup of coffee toward her. It is nothing, an ordinary courtesy. She takes it with a nod. The baby stirs, opens one eyelid, then closes it again. For a moment, the three of them form an unlikely triangle. A man whose life has been defined by boardrooms, an elder caught by the fragility of a single body, and a woman who has kept a child alive on the margins. The symmetry of roles feels new. "You did well," Samuel says again, softer this time. There is no press release, no dramatic speech, just two people in a corridor with an infant between them. He is not looking for adulation. He is looking for the reason the world once moved him to feel responsible beyond the ledger. "It was what needed to be done," she replies. Her hands fold around the baby's small feet. Samuel pauses, taken by the casualness of the statement. He had imagined reactions, gratitude, awe, perhaps deference. He had not imagined the quiet certainty of a person who is intimately acquainted with the work of survival. There is humility in her words, but also an unshakable fact. She is not a project. She is a person. When the doctor steps out to speak with them both, Samuel watches the way the doctor measures his words. "He's stable for now," she says. "We're keeping him overnight for monitoring. We'll know more after the CAT scan." "Will he," Samuel starts, because the rest of the sentence wants to be a bargain. Will he live? Will he be the same? Will anything about him change? "We don't know more than we will do what we can," the doctor replies. She is precise. She is kind. Later, in a quiet hour when the machines are steady and the corridor is soft with night shift lull, a nurse offers Natalia a paper card. It is a small, hospital-issued information sheet with resources for family members and a line with the social worker's number. Natalia reads it, nods, and tucks it into the blanket that cradles the baby. She does not ask for help with housing or money. She makes no claim on the men in suits who look like they live in other weather. Samuel finds himself wondering what the right next step is. He has 1,000 levers and a board of trustees who will prefer plans, proposals, and vetting. But there is a man on a hospital bed who was almost lost that night, and a woman who chose to stay when most would have kept moving. Action here cannot be merely a check. It must be human. He walks her to the small waiting area where the plastic chairs hold the night's stories. He remembers the one gift he gave when they first met, the card with a number and a name. He extends his hand and adds something he has not said out loud. "If you need anything while you're here, if there's anything at all, please tell my assistant," he says. "We can arrange for quiet things, food, a room if necessary." She looks at him, measuring the offer. Offers like this can carry strings. They can come with people who want to put narratives on others' lives, to save them on camera, to frame them in a light that suits the giver. She does not respond instantly. "Thank you," she says finally. It is as close to acceptance as she can give without feeling owned. She does not promise to call. She does not promise to be someone else. She simply receives a kindness and keeps herself intact. They stand in silence for a beat that includes the baby's soft breathing, the hum of a vending machine, the distant rhythm of a monitor. Samuel feels the oddness of the night settle into something like humility. He had thought the evening would be a line item in a ledger of good deeds. Instead, it is a chain of small necessities that all hinge on a single, wet decision to cross the street. A paramedic returns, shoulders slightly slack with the relief that comes with the end of a long call. "He's holding," the paramedic says. "We'll update you if things change, but tonight he's stable." Samuel draws in a breath that is part gratitude, part exhaustion. He has not yet named the thing that sits heavy in him. The realization that wealth can offer options but not answers. There are people who know how to respond who do not have the means to do so in better conditions. There are people who have the courage and the knowledge to act where others might only watch from a distance. He thanks the paramedics. He walks the corridor slowly as if the movement might align his thoughts into something more coherent. He had thought the evening would be a line item in a ledger of good deeds. Instead, it is a chain of small necessities that all hinge on a single, wet decision to cross the street. A paramedic returns, shoulders slightly slack with the relief that comes with the end of a long call. "He's holding," the paramedic says. "We'll update you if things change, but tonight he's stable." Samuel draws in a breath that is part gratitude, part exhaustion. He has not yet named the thing that sits heavy in him. The realization that wealth can offer options, but not answers. There are people who know how to respond who do not have the means to do so in better conditions. There are people who have the courage and the knowledge to act where others might only watch from a distance. He thanks the paramedics. He walks the corridor slowly, as if the movement might align his thoughts into something more coherent. At the end of the hallway, Natalia sits in the fluorescent light, the baby sleeping against her chest. Her profile is a study in concentration, attentive, not theatrical. As he approaches, she looks up and their eyes connect, an exchange that is brief and honest. He recognizes in her what he has been striving toward every time he signs a check, a human being who has chosen to act in a way that changes other people's lives. He also recognizes his own limitations. Money can build hospitals, but it cannot be the only response when emergency strikes. Empathy requires presence as much as funding does. "I'll be here," he tells her without thinking. "I'll be around tonight. If you need anything." She lets him finish. "Thank you," she says again. Her voice does not tremble. It neither seeks nor rejects help. It accepts it on her terms. Outside, the rain has softened to a patient drizzle. The city is quieter now, the generous lights reflecting in the puddles as if to remind him of the moment at the opening, a chandelier and a gutter caught by the same luminescence. The contrast stays with him, wealth and want, side by side, not as metaphor, but as a literal adjacency that demands response. He sits in the hallway with the small, ordinary urgency of someone who has learned the limits of his own planning. He thinks of his father's life, longer than his own, more crooked with history and stubbornness. He thinks of the woman with the baby and the scar on her arm, and the quiet ways she knows what to do in an emergency. The world, he realizes, is assembled out of moments like these, people choosing to stay when it would have been easier to move on. A nurse emerges and whispers that Edivaldo has been admitted to a private room for overnight monitoring. The equipment will hum for now. The doctor will come in the morning to review scans. Nothing is promised beyond the care to be given. In that pause, Samuel reaches for the card he had pressed into the woman's palm earlier that night and slips it into his wallet. It is a small gesture. It is not enough. He knows that. But it is a concrete reminder that his life, his resources, and his schedule are not meant to be separate from the lives that intersect with his, even if only by the happenstance of rain. He does not yet know what he feels. He knows only that the city's wet light has taught him something about the economy of attention, that it is worth the crossing, even when it upends the evening's plan. He leans back against the vinyl chair and watches the machines through the glass, their steady beeps stitching the night into a kind of order. Time bends around the hospital's rhythm. Nurses change shifts. The baby sleeps. Natalia rests, eyes closed for a moment, and when she opens them, they are steady, prepared for whatever comes next. Samuel stands, feeling the gravitational pull of responsibility, toward his father, toward the woman who saved him, toward a life that is more complicated than the measures on a balance sheet. Outside, rain tracks down the glass like a reel of memory. Inside, lives intersect and rearrange themselves in ways that cannot be forecast from a stage. The night stretches, long and sincere, and the small decision to cross the street remains the hinge of all that follows. Morning light arrived as a thin promise across the hospital windows. The steady beeps that had been the night's metronome softened into an ordinary rhythm. Edivaldo slept with a pale steadiness. Monitors tracked the body that had been pulled back from the edge. Samuel walked the corridor more slowly now, as if the pace could teach him humility. He had been a man used to decisions that landed cleanly on a ledger. Now he kept discovering debts he could not account for in numbers. The next days were pragmatic and small. There were phone calls with specialists, a catheterization that confirmed the blockage, and the plan that followed. Medication, physical therapy, better diet. Care that would need company and attention more than flash. Edivaldo, stubborn and gruff, accepted help in the way some men accept weather, with a grumble and a resignation that slowly gave way to gratitude. He watched Natalia with an interest that surprised them both. There was something about the way she checked his wrist and straightened his blanket that made him tell, at odd intervals, the stories of his youth. About a boat in the north, a fishing net that refused to behave, a woman he loved from a distance. Stories that were not for cameras, not for donors, but for a quiet audience who had stayed when it mattered. Samuel spoke to his assistants and his legal team because that was what habit required. He wanted to avoid patronage dressed as pity. He asked for a formal employment agreement, a paid caregiving position, clearly defined hours and duties, regular days off, and a stipend that could reach beyond the immediate crisis if she chose to stay. It was not a gift wrapped in PR. It was a job with dignity and paperwork, pay stubs, tax forms, a bank account set up on her name if she wanted it. He insisted on a private counsel who would explain everything and make sure there were no strings. When he offered the terms to Natalia in plain, careful speech, she read them like someone assessing a map. She asked practical questions about hours, privacy, responsibilities, and about what would happen if she wanted to leave. Samuel answered. She asked about whether the job would require her to perform medical tasks she was not trained for. He assured her she would receive training and that the role would respect professional boundaries. He asked if she was comfortable living in the house while Edivaldo recovered. She paused, thinking of the civility of porcelain and the unpredictability of being under someone else's roof. She accepted the job, not as a hand extended, nor as a favor taken, but as an agreement between two adults who had been placed in each other's lives by an odd weather pattern. Moving in was a quiet rearrangement. The back guest room was made into a small, practical space for Natalia and the baby. Fresh sheets, a folding crib, a lamp with a warm bulb. The staff were instructed to treat her as an employee and a person, not as a spectacle. She kept her own things in a single bag. She kept her independence in the way she asked for a key and explained when she might need time away. When Samuel handed her the keys, it was with both relief and an awkwardness he could not quite cover. "This is not charity," he said. "It's work, and if you ever want to change that arrangement, you can." She nodded. "I understand," she said, "and thank you." Days settled into a rhythm. Mornings began with medication and simple exercises, afternoons with short walks to keep muscles working, evenings with soft television and the smell of soup. Natalia learned how to find the way Edivaldo liked his pillows fluffed. She learned his thresholds for jokes and the names of the nurses who took the best care. In return, he listened the way people who have had long lives listen, slowly, with an interest that was sometimes coaxing, sometimes apologetic. Samuel watched all of this and felt himself reshaping in small increments. He stopped thinking of philanthropy as a series of announcements and began thinking of it as the slow accumulation of ordinary attentions. Sometimes he misstepped. He tried to arrange a donation to a shelter in Natalia's name and found her flatly refusing the spectacle. Sometimes he succeeded. The housekeeper learned to stop asking intrusive questions, the driver stopped telling stories at the dinner table. They learned each other's silences. There were moments of awkward proximity that softened into friendship. One evening, after a long day of therapy, Samuel found Natalia in the kitchen teaching herself to make a simple stew. No frills, just onion and tomato and a handful of herbs. The baby slept in a sling against her chest. Samuel lingered at the doorway, a man for whom the idea of cooking at midnight had been a foreign indulgence. "Do you want me to help?" he offered, which was the old language of his wealth, an offer to fix rather than to join. She smiled at him with the kind of humor that accepts an awkwardness and folds it into something warmer. "If you can chop an onion without crying, yes," she said. He tried to help and failed at the tears halfway through. They laughed, and something important happened in that laughter, the permission to be imperfect around one another. Conversations followed, small ones at first. She told him about her childhood in a town far from the city, where mornings smelled of coffee and tar, where she learned to sew and to watch over younger siblings. She did not tell him everything. She did not give a dramatic narrative of victimhood. She told him of choices, some made and some taken from her, with a clarity that surprised him. Samuel told her about the responsibilities that came with being a name people recognized. He told her about the nights when pledges felt hollow. "On stage," he said once, "watching the steam rise from a bowl of soup, I say words I've been told will move people, but the words are hollow if I don't know what happens when I cross the street." Their friendship deepened because it was not rushed. They set boundaries, what belonged to work and what belonged to the part of the house that was private. Samuel learns how to ask rather than decide. Natalia learns how to accept without being grateful to the point of erasure. The baby grew plump and steady under their combined attention. 2 weeks after the hospitalization, Edivaldo began to show slow improvements. He returned to a softer rhythm, one punctuated by physiotherapy sessions and visits from distant cousins who attempted awkward reconciliations. The household expanded in small ways. The doctor gave a guarded optimism. The days grew longer with activity, and the baby learned to smile with a mouth that mirrored the world. It was around this time that Clara entered their lives. Clara had been a figure in city philanthropy for years. a physician who had chosen, after a private loss, to channel her energies into outreach clinics and maternal health programs. She carried grief like a companion. There had been a daughter, taken by circumstances that had rewritten her family 20 years earlier. Clara's volunteer work was not performative. It was an attempt to build meaning from rupture. The crescent of her own past made her attentive to small marks: a birthmark, a scar from a childhood surgery, a certain tilt of speech. She had kept a photo of a child's hand in a drawer and a single memory that never left entirely. She first saw Natalia at the hospital clinic during a post-operative check. Clara was there that morning to consult on community outreach, talking to nurses and offering to review a training protocol. She moved through the hallway with a measured urgency, wearing sensible shoes, carrying a leather satchel with patient charts. When she passed the small waiting area, she caught sight of a woman with a sleeping infant and a unique crescent-shaped scar at the inside of her wrist, subtle, pale, and the exact shape of a crescent Clara had traced in her mind for 2 decades. The sight made her stop as if the world had shifted a gear. Clara did not approach with a proclamation. She believed in caution. She also believed in humility before possibility. She watched for a day or two, learning about the woman who had been there the night Edivaldo collapsed. She asked a nurse, gentle, discreet, whether the woman had been medically trained. The nurse shrugged. She knew what to do. She stayed with him until help arrived. Some people just know. Curiosity, not certainty, pushed Clara forward. She learned Natalia's name through the hospital's intake forms, the formal record that now included a job title. She arranged, through proper channels, to meet so that she could offer, if it was wanted, support in the form of a scholarship and mentorship for healthcare education. She did this not as an act of closure, but as a careful test of whether a past might be connected to a present. If the scar and memory aligned, great delicacy would be required. When Clara finally spoke to Natalia, it was in a small meeting room, not in the corridor, where the world passed like an indifferent theater. She introduced herself and explained her work. "I volunteer with a program that helps people get into training for nursing and allied health," she said. "We offer scholarships and mentorship. I can arrange for someone to sit with you about options, if you are interested." Natalia's face folded into a guarded attention. She had learned to measure offers. "I appreciate that," she said. "I don't want promises I can't keep." Clara nodded. "I know the difference," she replied. Then, softer, she added, "There is something, if you don't mind my asking. I noticed a scar on your wrist. It looked like one I remember from my daughter's child photos. It's an odd thing to say, but I thought I should ask if you would be open to talking." Natalia held herself still. The scar was a private thing, a remnant of a childhood illness treated hastily, a mark that had been with her through adolescence and the nights on the street. It was a memory of pain and survival. She had never thought it would be noticed by anyone with the particular hunger of a mother who had lost a child. For a moment, she weighed the possibility of explanations. "Do you think?" Clara's voice was small, the sentence unfinished. Natalia couldn't yet form an answer. She had no language that went easily to reunion or loss. She had learned survival by mending seams rather than demanding the sky. "I don't know," she said finally. "I don't know what that would mean." Clara suggested a cautious route: voluntary DNA testing arranged through the hospital social services, taken in a private room with counselors present. No cameras, no announcements, just a chance to know. Natalia asked how long the process would take. Clara explained the timeline: samples taken that week, results in several days to a few weeks depending on lab schedules. Clara's explanation was clinical, careful. She offered to pay for anything needed. She emphasized consent. There was no rush in her tone, only an honest willingness to know. Natalia considered the offer for a long time. She consulted Samuel privately, asking him what he thought. Samuel, who had been learning how to withhold a public reaction and allow private processes to unfold, told her he would support any choice she made. "This is yours," he said. "Whatever you decide, it's your decision." That word, yours, mattered. It allowed the next moments to be owned by the person whose life would change. Natalia agreed to the testing, setting terms and boundaries. She would meet Clara in neutral space. She would be present when the samples were taken. She would hear the results in private with a counselor. It was a rare arrangement, a path forward that honored both the potential wound and the human being attached to it. The waiting was the kind of slow business that cranes open wounds in unexpected ways. Time dilated around it. Natalia's days kept their rhythm, medication routines, baby naps, Samuel's presence at the periphery. But certain evenings were shaded by a small tension. She found herself tracing the scar absent-mindedly, imagining what might come. Clara, for her part, kept an even reserve. She volunteered more at the clinic, not because she could speed a test, but because she wanted to be near the possibility without intruding. When the call came from the genetic counselor, it was low and precise. "The sample indicates a high probability," the counselor said. "We would like to schedule a formal report and a time for you to meet with Dr. Clara to discuss next steps." The words were clinical, but their meaning was enormous. Clara's throat made a small sound that was almost a laugh and almost a sob. Natalia felt a tidal pull of something she did not have a name for: fear, curiosity, a cautious hope. The reunion was not cinematic. There were no sweeping orchestrations. Clara met Natalia in a private consultation room with soft light and tissues within reach. She did not ask the kind of dramatic questions dramas on television would. She asked about ordinary things: what Natalia remembered of her childhood, whether she had any contact with family members, whether she wanted to know more. Natalia's answers were careful, sometimes one word, sometimes expansive in jokes or in small memories of a riverbank and a neighbor's bread. Then Clara took a breath and showed a photo, an old picture, a child's hand curled in a small fist, an indistinct smile. "This is the last photograph I have," she said. "I have looked at it for 20 years. I don't want to force anything. I only wanted you to see it if you wanted to." Natalia looked at the picture and then at Clara. Time slowed. There was no immediate collapse into tears, no instant bridge across decades. Instead, there was a long, contemplative exhale, an astonishment at the plausibility of a life. The two women sat with an intimacy that was new and raw. When the tears came, they were slow and private. They were not an audience for redemption. They were two people meeting over a wound and a possibility. Weeks later, after the formal process had followed its careful bureaucratic rhythm, the results came with the weight they deserved. The DNA confirmed what both had quietly suspected. Clara's daughter had not been lost definitively. She had been separated, and the separation had been long and complicated. But it was now, in this peculiar cross-section of lives, possibly repaired. The reunion that followed was intimate. Clara and Natalia in a small hospital room with Edivaldo asleep nearby, a counselor present, and Samuel watching like a man who understood the need for restraint. The meeting stretched into a private conversation that handled grief and gratitude in equal measure. The two women speaking like neighbors learning to share a path. It was not instant resolution. There were long phone calls in which questions fluttered across like anxious birds. Why did this happen? What were the circumstances of your separation? Who else knew? There were documents to pore over, names to verify, and a complicated web of feelings to untangle. But there was also a growing tenderness. Clara brought an old sweater that smelled faintly of lavender and asked if Natalia would come, when she was ready, to dinner as family. That invitation, gentle and careful, was a small architecture of a future. As the weeks became months, real changes took root. Clara became a steady presence, sometimes practical, helping to navigate the paperwork needed for Natalia to enroll in classes. Sometimes simply present, making soups that arrived unannounced and staying for a quiet cup of tea in the corner of the living room. She did not step into the role of a mother with theatrical pronouncements. She learned to ask names for childhood toys, to listen to silences, to offer a steady hand when grief surfaced. Natalia, for her part, allowed herself fragments of trust: an evening at Clara's apartment, a walk in the small park, the sight of a hand that suddenly had history attached. Complicated joy spread slowly through their meetings. Samuel watched this tentative family form with a mixture of relief and a new kind of contentment. He and Natalia found their connection evolving. Respect deepened into affection in ways neither of them raced to name. There were moments that suggested a romance. The way Samuel stayed late to help Natalia adjust a baby monitor one night. The way Natalia once learned to play piano slightly out of tune to make Edivaldo smile. The quiet look they shared after Clara's first awkward visit. For both of them, a private recognition that their lives had braided into something richer. Neither rushed the moment. There were also moments of doubt. Natalia worried she would betray her new bond with Clara if she allowed another love to grow. Samuel worried about the optics and the power balance. They spoke of everything in short, honest sentences, the way people with nothing to advertise speak. "I don't want you to feel like a charity case," he said once, in the glass light of the kitchen. "I want to be with you because I want to be with you." She answered with a steady gaze. "And I don't want to be someone's rescue," she said. "If we're here, let's be here as people." They built a relationship on the scaffolding of mutual choice. Samuel learned to ask rather than assume. Natalia learned to accept rather than owe. There were dates that were simple: walks in the park, pushing the baby stroller, lunches with Clara where conversation flowed easily, nights when they read aloud to Edivaldo, who liked absurdly romantic lines from a paperback novel. The city around them continued its noisy business. Inside, a new, careful domestic practice took root. Work and education became part of Natalia's plan. With Clara's guidance and a scholarship arrangement Clara helped orchestrate through the hospital's outreach fund, Natalia enrolled in a certified nursing assistant program, an entry route that allowed her to build clinical skills while maintaining income and care responsibility. The program had lectures, practicals, tests, and the small indignities and triumphs of learning in a classroom that sometimes expected a polished past. Natalia attended with the resilience of someone who had always been resourceful. She studied while the baby slept in a crib in the classroom's observation room, bringing the child's soft presence into a world of manuals and measured respirations. Samuel supported her in tangible ways without trying to own the process. He arranged for paid time off, a flexible schedule, and a mentor in the hospital who would offer training. He paid for childcare when needed and, importantly, he kept his mouth closed when it mattered, letting Natalia shape her own ambitions. As she completed the program, Clara became a guiding light, recommending courses and writing letters that opened doors. Months of work and study turned into credentials, and credentials into the next step, an application to a rigorous nursing degree program that could, years later, lead to medical school if she chose that path. The choice to pursue medicine remained Natalia's. She had watched Clara with a mixture of awe and curiosity. The idea of entering medicine was not new. She had tended wounds and soothed fevers since childhood. But the structural path was daunting. Clara offered mentorship, scholarship guidance, and the possibility of letters of recommendation. Natalia applied, not with a sense of entitlement, but with the slow steadiness of someone who had decided to pursue a dream on her terms. At home, the family grew more intimate in little ways. Edivaldo attended therapy and grew less fragile. He learned to ask about the baby's development and, sometimes, to complain about modern music with the same gruff humor that marked his generation. Clara's presence made the house feel fuller without being intrusive. Samuel and Natalia navigated their lives with a softness that had been absent from both of their pasts. Less spectacle, more patience. Then, Late one summer, when the baby had grown into a curious toddler who liked to bang spoons and watch ants march in a line, Natalia discovered she was pregnant again. The news arrived not as a dramatic announcement, but as a quiet, private wonder, a slow, unfolding certainty that made her knees feel slightly unsteady. She told Clara first, a conversation that was full of tears and laughter and practical advice. Clara's joy was tempered by the memory of past loss. She did not leap, but she held, and her hands shook in a way that made Natalia's heart expand with empathy. When Natalia told Samuel, he said nothing for a very long time. He sat with the news like a man listening to a small, bright bell. Then he reached for her hand and said, "We will figure out everything. We'll be present. We'll be here." The promise was simple and enormous at once. The months that followed were busy and gentle. Natalia continued her studies as capacity allowed, juggling prenatal appointments and afternoon classes. Clara and Samuel tended to the administrative tasks that could be handled without making headlines, arranging for additional childcare, ensuring medical appointments were on schedule, adjusting work commitments. Natalia's health was monitored carefully and realistically. The doctors did not offer guarantees, but they offered competence and measured optimism. The baby grew in her belly like a secret garden. When Natalia received the news that she had been accepted into a post-baccalaureate pre-med program, an opportunity that would begin after the birth, the cabin of her chest filled with a warmth that was not simply relief. It was the sensation of a life that could expand beyond survival. She wept in Clara's kitchen with a mug between her hands and laughed until she hiccuped. There were practical plans to make, of course. Tuition schedules, childcare plans, the timing of study. But the emotional labor, the permission to hope, felt like a new currency. And then, in a moment that landscaped everything, Clara and Natalia decided together to pursue the possibility of a public but tastefully managed reunion. They wanted to tell the story carefully, to friends, to family, to the child who would one day ask questions. They did not want spectacle. They wanted truth. They wanted the past acknowledged without being exploited. Edivaldo, too, had a small role. He insisted on cooking a simple dinner to welcome Clara into the house in a way that made the family laugh because he burned the onions and then tried to salvage the meal with a peculiar story about a boat and a net. The pregnancy progressed with its mix of joy and fatigue. Samuel learned to be present in the small things, rubber ducks and late-night grocery runs. He learned to be quiet when asked and to speak when asked. He learned to accept that not all his solutions were financial. There were conversations about names and schooling and ways to balance careers who had made mistakes but now could offer something sturdier, an honest, visible presence. By the time the baby was due, months had layered into a narrative that felt both fragile and durable. Natalia gave birth in a hospital where Clara had once been staff, and where Samuel could sit with a restraint that was almost prayerful. The labor was long and brave, and when a little human emerged with a squall and a face like a future, the room filled with a kind of astonished silence. Clara and Samuel both held tears that had no theatricality to them. They were simply the wetness of people who had learned to treasure small miracles without naming them miraculous. The days after the birth were deliciously ordinary. Feedings, late-night lullaby practices, a discovery that the baby favored a particular spoon, as if that spoon were a talisman. Evobaldo pressed a tentative kiss to the newborn's brow and grunted with approval. He grew soft around the edges in a way that was honest and endearing. Time kept moving. Natalia's application to the nursing degree progressed. She completed prerequisites that had once seemed unreachable. The hospital community rallied around in practical ways: scholarships, mentorships, study groups. Clara arranged for quiet tutoring sessions and accompanied Natalia to exams as a steady hand. Samuel kept his commitments at work, but made room for the things that mattered: school plays, clinical practicums, the occasional scraped knee that required a comforting presence rather than legal counsel. Their life was not without tension. There were conscience questions and tiny betrayals of habit, a misread message, an uncle with opinions, a fundraising gala that pressed at Samuel to speak in the old manner. But they met these frictions with conversation and the willingness to repair. Natalia insisted on shaping her future rather than having it shaped for her. Samuel listened and adjusted. Clara held the past with a tenderness that allowed for new stories to be born. When the day came that a formal DNA registry cleared the administrative lines and officially recognized the bond between Clara and Natalia, there was a small ceremony. Quiet, private, without speeches, simply the exchange of a few photographs and a shared cup of tea. They did not declare a perfect ending. They acknowledged the work that would continue. They laughed about things like who would be the child's godparent, the answer being, without undue ceremony, both Clara and Samuel. Years did not pass like a fairy tale, but like a mosaic, small pieces making a larger design. Natalia moved from the paid caregiving position to a formal role in the hospital, supported by scholarships and part-time work. She finished her nursing degree, surprising herself with the confidence she had built in a classroom where she no longer felt like an outsider. Encouraged by mentors and buoyed by the reality that she belonged in this space, she applied for medical school. The application process was grueling, a meritocratic test that required years of study, recommendation letters, and the kind of perseverance that had already defined much of her life. Months later, in a moment that felt both private and public, she was accepted into a medical training program that would, in time, qualify her as a physician. The acceptance letter was not a stamp of destiny. It was an invitation to a long apprenticeship. But it was enough to widen the horizon. The household contracted and expanded in response. Schedules were adjusted, Clara tutored for biology sections. Samuel negotiated for more humane hours where possible. They did not pretend the path would be easy. They prepared for the long haul. And love, quietly, found its natural home. Samuel and Natalia did not wake one morning and find themselves in a novel. Their romance grew like the rest of their life, incremental, honest, rooted in the everyday. There were gestures, waiting outside an exam room with coffee, unexpected bouquets after a long night, arguments that ended in laughter, that knitted ordinary tenderness into deeper attachment. They married in a small ceremony in a municipal garden under the careful attendance of friends and family that had formed in the town of disruptions and reconciliations. Edivando walked them down a modest path, cane in hand, grinning as a man who desired nothing more than a good meal and less noise. Clara gave a speech that was not grandiose. She spoke of the quiet courage of persons who choose to stay, to show up, to become more than what circumstance dictated. She called Natalia by the name she had always used in private, a name that carried the weight of childhood and the light of found family. There were tears and there was laughter. There was a pot of stew gone wrong because some things simply could not be fixed by ceremony. The story did not end in a single scene of redemption. There were long nights of study, of balancing bills and hospital shifts, of parenthood's small violences and joys. There were regulatory meetings and nights when a child had a fever and both parents kept vigil. Natalia's medical training stretched on. As certainties shifted, she passed exams, lost sleep, and gained competence. Each small victory rewired confidence into skill. In quiet moments, Samuel revisited that rain-soaked night from time to time, not as a memory he could claim ownership of, but as a hinge in the narrative of his life. He had crossed the street because he could, but what had mattered more than the act itself was how the act had connected him to other people who were equally capable of doing something important. He had learned that money could open doors, but not cultivate courage. He had learned to stand aside and let others' voices shape outcomes. He had discovered that reciprocity is not a ledger balanced by a check. It is a mutual recognition that each person brings resources that matter. Years after the rainstorm, the family sat together on a terrace that faced a modest garden. The baby, no longer a baby, built fortresses with wooden blocks. Natalia had a small stethoscope slung around her neck as a joke for the child, and kept a stack of textbooks in a corner. Clara planted herbs in a pot that Edivaldo insisted on calling medicine for the soul. Samuel brewed coffee with a careless expertise that now made sense in the domestic arena. The house hummed with the ordinary music of life. One evening, as the sun set in a wash of apricot and the little child's laugh rose like a small trumpet, Samuel and Natalia sat on the steps and watched the puddles that had once reflected a chandelier. The rain had returned that week, a polite spring shower that made the city smell sharp and alive. They did not speak at first. The past had become a map they both knew, the rainstorm a starting point, not a miracle. "Do you remember that night?" Samuel asked finally, voice low. Natalia smiled and tucked her hair behind her ear. "I remember you," she said, "shaking umbrella and all." He laughed softly. "I remember you more clearly than that. I remember the way you held him." He gestured to the toddler playing nearby. "I remember how you didn't wait for someone else to do something." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "You came that night," she said. "You could have walked past." "I could have," he replied, "and I wouldn't have known half of what matters." They stayed like that as the sky grew darker, and the lights of the city began to wink on. Neighbors returning home, a dog barking somewhere, someone singing in a flat across the way. The family was imperfect and messy and whole. There was grief that lingered like a shadow, and there was a plenitude that arrived not from money alone, but from the accumulation of small acts, presence, competence, respect. At the table that night, Clara made an unremarkable soup, and Edivaldo told a tale about a fish that always slipped away. Laughter rose around the room, and the child fell asleep against Natalia's chest, as if the world had always been arranged this way. The future looked like work and love and nights of study, not like a tidy resolution. That was enough. If there was a single image that would stay with Samuel, the one he would think might convince anyone with his resources to cross a wet street, it was not the glitter of the chandelier or the look of relief on a television camera. It was the small hand of a woman who had kept a child alive under a bus stop awning, later steadying his own father with the same hands. It was the knowledge that generosity without presence risks becoming theater, and that presence without capacity can still be heroic. It was the fact that their lives had been rewoven, not by a single savior, but by the reciprocal attention of many. Years later, when Natalia completed her medical degree and walked across the stage with a hood and a diploma, Samuel sat in the audience like a man who had learned how to be both grateful and accountable. Clara sobbed quietly beside him, not from triumph alone, but from a deep and complicated gratitude. Edivaldo waved an old hand in a way that said simply, "I have lived to see something I did not expect." The final scene was not a curtain call, but a kitchen table at dawn. A child fingered a plastic stethoscope. Textbooks lay open. A kettle whistled. Outside, rain began again, soft as mercy. The family gathered. Found family, blood family, a man who had learned to cross streets and a woman who had learned to accept help without losing herself. They had redefined what it meant to be related. If anyone asked later what had changed everything, Samuel would point to that night, and then, with the humility he'd learned, point to the many small moments that followed. The rainstorm had been the inciting image, the night that bent their lives together. The rest had been a long, patient labor of mutual care. If this story moved you, consider sharing it, and, in your own way, supporting local shelters, community health training, or volunteer programs that help people gain the skills they need. No single gesture fixes everything, but small acts of presence, respect, and support can change lives.